But we are in Hebrews chapter 11. So if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead, take them out, turn over to Hebrews chapter 11 here, because as you go through Hebrews chapter 11, which we have been. I think this is now week number 3, and we still got several more weeks to go in Hebrews chapter 11. You're going to notice a phrase that was repeated over and over and over again. And that phrase is a very simple phrase. It's the phrase, by faith. By faith here. And the whole point of it is that people were living by faith and that there was an action involved in it. And that's why I titled this message actually that faith moves us towards God. Faith moves us towards God is what's the title of it, because we see over and over and over again that there is men and women that had faith in God, and always that faith was going to move them. And they did something by faith. And honestly, the more that I thought about it here and the more that I kept reading over this passage, this chapter this week, and just seeing like by faith, Abel sacrificed. By faith, Enoch walked and he was taken up to be with the Lord. And this week it's by faith, Abraham. And I was like, man, if somebody put Joel Hastings in this chapter, they would be dumb, number one. But like if they did, what would be the story? What would be after that? That by faith, Joel Hastings did what? And I'm like, man, I need to do some more things by faith, because, and honestly, like some of us here, like there's hardly anything that we've ever done by faith, right? Like if we were to put, what would it be for your story? Like if you just had to say, like by faith, what would that be? Some of us, it's like, well, there was that one time my gas light went on and I was still in Tampa and I made it all the way back to Brooksville, right? That was by faith and by fumes. That was like the biggest moment of faith you've ever had in your life. Some of you are like, I don't have that amount of faith, right? I do. I know my car. That's a true story. And so, but like, it's like by faith, Bob like stayed up through his granddaughter's dance recital. It's like, he's like, he wasn't sure, but he made it, right? It's like, what is it in your life that you could actually say, by faith, I have done something and there was nothing else, there was no other reason why I was able to make it, but I just trusted God in that moment and he carried me through. I hope there are moments in that in your life here, because we get to look at an example of Abraham, and it's a wonderful example of how his faith continued to move him towards God. And so if you have your Bibles, open up to Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to start in verse 8 today. It says, that phrase, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. And so it starts out and it says, by faith, what? Abraham obeyed. Abraham obeyed. And you really can't have true faith if you also don't have obedience, right? Because you can say, yeah, I have faith in God, but I'm not going to do what he says. I'm not going to listen to him in my finances. I'm not going to listen to him with my sexual life. I'm not going to listen to any of those things. Then you really don't have faith in him and what he said is true and best for you, right? So faith is always going to include obedience. Oh, Abraham obeyed. If you remember this story here, all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, one of the most important passages in the Old Testament, if not the Bible, God comes to Abraham. Abraham was still a pagan, by the way. He came from a pagan land. God just shows up and he's like, Abraham, you're my boy now. I'm going to give you this land and I'm going to give you a nation. And all you have to do is just follow me. All you have to do is obey. And Abraham got up and he left and he was going to a place that he did not know to receive an inheritance. But here's the part that gets me, not knowing where he was going. So he just literally told him, like, hey, Abraham, you go back and read Genesis 12. He's like, Abraham, just get up and go, and I'll tell you when to stop. Which would drive me crazy, right? Like, I don't know if anybody else is like this, but even like if I'm driving in my car and my wife is next to me and she's giving me directions, I'm like, no, I need to know every turn. Like, I need to have the map in front of me. I can't just like sit here and wait for her to say turn left. Like, that's like, who does that, right? I need to know every single step of the way so I can process through that. But here, Abraham, not only did he not know the next step, like he didn't know anything. God just said, hey, go, and I'll just tell you when to stop, Abraham. How many of us would have that type of faith? Like, could you imagine if you just, if you were out there and your neighbor was packing up a U-Haul, you went up to him and was like, hey, bro, like you're moving away? Like, where are you moving to? I don't know. Like, okay, so why are you moving? God told me to. Okay, and you'd probably be walking away being like, I'm kind of glad they're leaving. Like, right? Like But yet that's what he did. He packed up everything and he moved. Why? Because faith moves us into obedience. Faith moves us into obedience. That's the first point in your bulletin here. And that you cannot have true faith without being willing to say, I also have obedience to follow him. But the hard part is in that moment, that faith is always going to be in that moment where you don't know what's next. Because if you knew everything that was in front of you, it wouldn't be faith. Let me just illustrate this. I'm going to call my BFF up here, Devin. And I successfully did this morning, and he didn't die. So let's see if we can make it through another one. I've stopped asking him if he trusts me. He knows that he shouldn't at this point here. But I'm going to put on a mask here for him. And this is something that I do, every single staff meeting just to build trust. No, I'm just kidding. But here's the deal. Let's make it a little bit tougher. I'm going to spin around a little bit. All right, now, here we go. We'll stop there. Now, Devin, there is, as you know, there's going to be a ledge about probably 5 feet in front of you, maybe 4, maybe 10, I don't know. There's a ledge in front of you, though, Devin. And all I need him to do right now is to listen close enough that he's going to stop before he hits that ledge, or else it's going to be a really great sermon. But all he has to do is listen and obey. Now, if he didn't have a mask on, this would be a very simple process, right? Because he could see exactly where he needs to go. He could see exactly when he needs to stop. But with the mask on, it's a lot more difficult because now he has to trust him. Trust me, his BFF. And so Devin, can you just take 2 medium steps forward? All right, you got one. Come on. One step. One more step. There we go. Take another 6 inches there. You got it. A little bit more, a little bit more. I'll stop right there. Okay. It's a lot scarier when you don't know where you're going, right? But this is often what our faith has to look like with God because we don't know where he's taking us. You can take that mask off now. One of these times, yeah, you did get really close this time. One of these times I'm going to make us all get up and leave and he's just going to be standing here. But here's the deal, that is what our faith in Christ looks like oftentimes. He's not going to tell us everything that we want to know. And so instead of us being able just to see and say, I'm going to make this plan for my life, we just simply have to say, I'm going to trust him. When God says take a step, then I'm going to obey him because I know that he's not going to lead me into anything that I shouldn't be at. And sometimes it's going to feel like he might have, but even then we can trust him still. And so as we go on here in verse number 9, it goes on to say, by faith, once again, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him out of the same promise here. So he left the Ur of the Chaldees, where he was from, where he was born and raised, where all his family was from. And then he left all of that to go live in a land of promise, the promised land, that him and all the generations to follow for the next thousands upon thousands of years, his people, his children were going to live in this land. It's a promised land. But notice here, as he was living in the land of promise, he lived as if it was a foreign land, living in tents. See, if you were to go out here and you were to buy one of these beautiful fields all around here, and you were to set up and say, you know what, this is the thing to do in Brooksville is to have a family compound, apparently. And so it's I'm going to set up my family compound right here in this field over here for generation upon generation upon generation. We're all going to live out here in this field. The very first thing that you'd probably want to do after you buy that field out there is what? Build a house, right? You want to build a place that you and your family could actually live there for a long time to come. But Abraham didn't do that. When he got to the land that God had promised him, he still lived in tents. That indicates that there's something that he knew that this wasn't actually the place that he was ultimately going to be at. Listen, whenever I was 15, 16, we went on a 3-week trip to California with my parents, and we had a pop-up camper. And a pop-up camper is something after you get there, you have to take a crank, and you crank it up, and then you crank it a little bit higher, and you pull out the beds. And it's a lot nicer than sleeping on the ground. It's not an RV, but it's all right. And so we went on this 3-week trip, and we got out there. We were starting to drive towards California. On the second night, we went out to crank up our pop-up camper, and it wouldn't crank. And then now I was okay, we still have 3 more weeks of this, but our car wasn't big enough just to take all the stuff that was inside the camper and throw it in the car. So then we had to still drag around this pop-up camper everywhere we went, but we had to buy a tent, shove a tent inside there. Every time we got to a campground, we took the tent out, set the tent up right beside the pop-up camper that wasn't working, and you would not believe the weirdest looks that we got from all the other campers. They're you know that thing pops up, right? It's like, yes, we know. But the fact was, the matter was, like, we were living not where we were planning on it. We were living not where we wanted to, but we were having to live out in the tents right beside it, right? But Abraham, he chose this. He chose this and said, you know what? This is the land that God has given me. But instead of setting up my houses, I'm still going to live in tents. And we asked, like, why though, Abraham? What's the point of any of that here? And here's the reason why. He wasn't ultimately living for that land. He was looking still to something better that was coming. Even though he was in the land of promise, he knew that there was still something better ahead of him. And that's in verse 10. It goes on to say, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And this is a wonderful word for us because many of us, we feel like God has like a promised land here on this earth, right? If we just, take Dave Ramsey's class, and I hope you do, financial freedom, and we'll find financial stability, then we'll be in our promised land, and we'll be fine. We won't have any worries. Or maybe if I take the marriage class, my marriage will be all right, and my wife or my husband will start acting better. Then my life we'll reach that promised land here on earth. And listen, I hope you get all of those things and more, but in reality, Abraham, he knew that whatever was on this earth wasn't the real promised land, that there was still something better, and he was longing for what's better here. And so there isn't going to be any moment of this life that is going to completely satisfy you. It was never designed to, because as Christians, we get to long for something even better, which is ahead of us. And so don't be content with just right now, but try to look forward to that. And we see that not only did Abraham live that way, but also Sarah did as well. In verse 11, it says, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, and she considered him faithful who had promised. Now, Abram means father, by the way. Sarah is like a queen, but then they changed their name, so now Abraham means father of the nations. And imagine here, if that was your name, like literally people knew that was your name, father of nations. What's the first question that you'd ask somebody that, like, how many kids you got? 0, right? Like how awkward would all of those conversations be? But part of the promise that God gave Abraham and Sarah back in Genesis 12 was this. He said, not only am I going to give you land for all the generations, so I'm going to make a great and mighty nation out of you. So much so that all the world is going to be blessed because of you and this coming Messiah. But it's going to be so many people are going to come from you. This is a wonderful gift to Abraham and Sarah here. And Sarah is going to receive the power to conceive. And that might not sound significant until you remember whenever they first got that promise, Abraham was about 75 and Sarah was about 10 years younger, 65. And now if somebody came to you and you're over 65 years old and you said, hey, you're going to have a child here soon, number one, you'd be like, not me, right? No. But then also, if I was Abraham, I'd be like, okay, if I truly believe this, and they did, I'm thinking like 9 months in a day, right? Because the clock is ticking here. We're already past that time. They're already past that age. But yet she started to believe, and she did believe. But if you remember the story here, in Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham and Sarah sound pretty much like superheroes, right? God just showed up. God said, leave, and I'm going to give you this land. And they leave everything, and then I'm going to give you this nation. And they just believe. And it sounds like they don't have any struggles. But if you know the story from Genesis, that's not the full story, is it? See, even like, for instance, in Acts chapter 7, there's another passage in the New Testament that talks about the Old Testament saints there. And this is Stephen's sermon here, and he gives a little bit even more insight here when he said, brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. Verse 3. And he said, go out from your land and go out from your kindred. So leave everything and your family and go into the land that I will show you. Verse number 4 says, and then he went out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And after his father died, God removed him from there into this land in which you are now living. Did you notice something a little bit odd here? God said, leave all of your land, leave all of your possessions, leave all of your kindred, your family. Then in the next verse, it says, after his father died. After his father died, then he actually left and went into the promised land. And my question is like, wait. How'd you know your father died, Abraham? See, because he took his father with him. So he had faith enough to just trust and follow after God, but he didn't have faith enough to leave his father. His father, in the original language, literally, his name means wanderer. And so Abraham had to keep wandering around until finally his father died. He delayed the promised land by 5 years while he was living in Haran instead of Canaan, the promised land. And that's true for so many of us. We say, God, I will follow you. I will obey. Just let me kind of bring some of my baggage along, right? Let me kind of bring some of the things that I'm not willing to give up. I know I'm supposed to follow you, but there's also some things here in my life that I don't want to give up to follow you. And you start to delay the very promises of God for you and for your life because you are unwilling to fully follow and fully leave all of those other things behind here. If we actually go back to that verse about Sarah in Hebrews chapter 11, it says, by faith now Sarah received power to conceive. If you remember that story, that was also a long story, wasn't it? For 25 years now, for 25 years, they had to wait. And if you remember, once they finally got to that promised land, they were still waiting to have a child. And immediately a famine starts to happen. And they start to doubt the promises of God. God has promised that they are going to have a child. But yet when they get down to Canaan, the promised land, they go through a famine. And so they flee down to Egypt. And as soon as they get down to Egypt, he looks over at his wife and realizes that she's very beautiful. Okay? And so because she was very beautiful, he starts to get scared. Which, by the way, Sarah's 65 years old, so props to Sarah, okay? Because what's about to happen is the Pharaoh looks at Sarah, who's 65 years old, and says, man, she is beautiful. I want to take her as my wife. And so Abraham comes up with this plan and says, tell the Pharaoh, you're not my wife, you're my sister. And so instead of trusting God, that God's going to provide, he lies to save his own life, even though God has already promised these things, that they're going to have a child and that he shouldn't have to worry about being killed yet. And so they go in, and then the plagues happen in Egypt there, and so then they have to come back out. They go into the promised land, and then a few years later, guess what? It happens again. This time she's even much older. She's getting near 90 years old, which once again, props for Sarah. You go, girl, right? Like, I don't know what she was doing with Pilates or whatever, but like Aubrey King wanted to marry this woman right now. And so once again, he lies. It's like men, don't do that, all right? Don't lie about your wife being your sister. That's weird. I don't know why I needed to say that in a sermon, but here's the deal, they doubted over and over and over again, and finally reached the climax whenever they were sitting in their tent one night, and Sarah looks over to her husband and says, I don't think it's actually going to happen. I don't think I'm ever going to actually have a baby. You should take your maid as your wife and have a baby with her instead. Once again, men, don't do that either. Free point. But they struggled to believe. She struggled to believe, but yet she kept coming back. Even though she didn't always have this type of faith, there were moments here. The reason that she was able to persist wasn't even her faith, but rather she considered the one to be faithful. And when we struggle and we say, God, I don't know how much longer I can have faith. Well, guess what? We have a faithful God. And so get your eyes off of yourself and what you can do, and get your eyes onto Jesus and what he already has done. He's been faithful, and we can have faith. And in that moment here now, they were able to have faith. And whenever finally 3 men came to them, and they said, by this time next year, this is God himself, said, this time next year, Sarah's going to have a baby. She's 90 years old. What would you do if I went up to a 90-year-old woman and prophesied that she's going to have a baby next year? You would do exactly what she would do. She laughed. She laughed. Laughter in Hebrew, Isaac. That's where that name came from. They named their son Laughter because the laughter that she brought. See, even when you can't believe it, even when you can't, that you have stumbled so many times over and over and over and over again, God is still faithful even then. And what I love about Hebrews chapter 11 is none of that story is mentioned, right? All of the times that they fell over and kept tripping over themselves and kept lacking faith in God, none of that's remembered. The only thing that's remembered is their act of faith. Their act of faith, and that's what faith does. It allows us to leave all of those mistakes behind us. See, because you did not come to God by your good works, and neither do your bad works disqualify you from being with God. And so this is what faith does, and it's the next point in your bulletin, is that faith moves us past our past. It moves us past. We can leave all of that behind. God has already gotten rid of that. He doesn't remember it anymore. And so what we need to do is have faith and move forward. And so in the verse 12, as we go on here, it says, therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead. I don't know what age you have to be for the Bible to consider you good as dead, but Abraham reached it, and you know you old if the Bible says that about you. And we're descendants. We're born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, as many as innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. He was 100 years old as Isaac is born. See, if they were newlyweds and they had Isaac, you would say that's normal. Newlyweds just have babies. That's what they do. But when you're 100 and you have a baby, you have to say, you know what? That's from God. And this is the reason why he was making him wait, why they were making it, because he wanted to say, this is from me, and I still need to develop some things in you, Abraham. I still need to develop some things in Sarah. And so sometimes we get so consumed with the end product without realizing it's actually that process of waiting that God uses us to refine us to trust him more. And the next point in your bulletin is this, that faith moves us at God's speed. One of the hardest things for Christians, I talk to Christians literally every single week, and every single time, every single week, I have at least one conversation of one of the people in here is in a moment of waiting, right? You're waiting on something to change. You're waiting on something to get better. You just have to keep waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. But oftentimes it's in that waiting, that's when God teaches us what we need to be. Shows us who we need to be. And he says, I'm less concerned with your 5-year plan than I am with my 5 million year plan. And in 5 million years from now in heaven, you're not going to be concerned that it took an extra 6 months for you to get to that place that you're longing for. But we need to learn to trust him even in that waiting, right? So in verse 13 now, it says, these all died in faith. We looked at this last week a little bit. These all are going to die, not having received the things that are promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all get to the promised land, but yet they're still living in tents. They realize that there's still a better city. They're not looking for Jerusalem. They're looking for the new Jerusalem. They're looking for the Messiah. They know that one day all the nations are going to be blessed through one of their descendants. They can kind of see it, but it's a little bit fuzzy there. And so what do you have to do? You have to learn to trust them even when you can't see it very clearly, even when it's not seen at all. Listen, has anybody ever gone whitewater rafting in here? Several of us, good. Listen, I've gone several times. One thing that I've realized recently is like every time that I go whitewater rafting, like I never actually stop and look up to see like how dangerous this actually is. I just kind of assume like, okay, there's professionals there. I'm going to be in a boat with a professional. I don't have anything to worry about. And then I get to that place with the professional and realize it's some like high school dropout that lives in a van by the river and is like on summer break here from, living somewhere else in a van in the river. And I'm like, this doesn't make me feel as safe. And even the last time that I went was in at our college retreat last year in Gatlinburg. And as I was driving I was driving a whole bunch of our kids up to the whitewater rafting area. And about every 100 yards, as we got closer, every 100 yards, there was a police car. And it had lights on. I was like, this is weird. And I realized that some of the moms are hearing this for the first time, which is going to be interesting. But I'm like, this doesn't seem very normal. There's a lot of police on the river today for some reason. And so we finally get to the place we're going, and I go inside, and the first thing I ask is like, hey, why are there so many policemen outside? They're like, well, actually, somebody did drown today. It's like, oh no. Now he was drinking and doing his own thing on his own little inner tube and not part of the company. But still in that moment now, it's like somebody died on this river today. Like I am going to pay very close attention to the instructions that they give me now, right? And so we get in the boat. And if you've ever been in that situation, there's always a guide in the back of the boat. And he's that guy that tells you exactly what to do. The guy that's on summer break from somewhere. But he tells you, like he's like, hey, row 3 times and you paddle 3 times. And then sometimes we'll say like left side, paddle twice. And you have to paddle twice if you're on the left side, but not move if you're on the right side. And he's going to very strategically get us down that river, because sometimes even with that whitewater rafting, right, you can't even see the rocks, but there's dangerous rocks underneath you that he's trying to avoid. But I've realized something about myself. Whenever I get in that moment, in that whitewater rafting, and it's starting to get really bumpy and really crazy here, my instinct, you know what it is to get out of there, right? And so when I get in that whitewater rafting, I'm just wanting to be like, I gotta get out of here, I gotta go. But in reality, the reason why is I shouldn't do that is because when I start to do that, I'm going to ram us into the rock that he's trying to get us to avoid. I need to have trust in him that when he says to paddle once, I just got to paddle once because he's been on this road before. He knows exactly where the destination is, and I just simply have to trust him. If I trust him and do what he says here, he's going to guide me down that river. And for us too, whenever life gets a little bumpy, it gets a little rocky here, I think all of us are prone just to say, well, get me out of here, right? I don't want to be here anymore. I'm just going to go crazy. But God's saying, listen, no. I know exactly where all these bumps are. I know exactly the path that I need you to take. You just need to trust me and to move when I say move, even when you can't see it, even when it doesn't make sense. And the next point in your bulletin is this, is that move towards God even when you can't see what he's doing. Even when, and that's the hardest part, just like with Devin here, when you can't see what's next here, but that is what faith is, to trust him even still. And the rest of verse 13 says this, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. That word acknowledge is the word confession, and it means to say the same thing. They were all saying this very same thing, that they were strangers. That means foreigners and exiles, mean that they weren't welcome here. So they looked around on this promised land, the land that God gave them, and they said, like, this isn't really our homeland. And for us as Christians, we can look out on this world and watch the news or just go outside and interact with people, and you should be able to realize that this is not my home. I'm longing for something better here. I'm seeking something better here. And that's where they were, and that's where we need to be as well. For verse 14, it goes on to say, for people who speak thus, and that's thus meaning that they were saying that they're the exiles, they're the strangers, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. That word in the Greek for homeland is literally fatherland. And I like that because they're seeking their father's land. They're seeking the Father's home. That is their greatest longing, not for this life, but for something that is coming here. You're never going to be fully content in this life. But God has given us something better that we can continue to pursue. And so in verse 15, it goes on to say, if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. See, if he was going in the promised land, and it wasn't as easy as maybe he thought it would be, right? Whenever he got that promise from God that he's going to have this land and he's going to have children, but then now he's waiting, he's living in a tent, there's still no children around. Like in that moment here, it would have been tempting probably for him to say, you know what, back in Ur of the Chaldees, where I was from, I still have family back there, I still have friends back there, my house is still on the market back there, I could go back and I could move in, and whenever you start to think about that old way of life, you will find opportunities to get back there. And for some of us as well, we start to think about like, well, you know what? I follow Jesus and this life hasn't really gotten any easier. In fact, sometimes it's gotten even a lot harder than it used to be. I remember back before I was saved, I could go out to the bars, I could have a good time. I didn't have to worry about any of these things. It was just so much easier. And if that's your mindset here, you will find opportunities to make your way back in that old way of life. And so what he's saying here is leave all of that behind and move forward. Move forward because God has something better even still than anything else this world has to offer. And that's the last point, is move towards God because what he has is better than everything. What he has is better than everything else this world has to offer here. So you can leave all of that behind and move towards him even when you can't see the next steps. And the last verse is this. But as it is, they desire a better country. A better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. They are looking forward to something better even still. You know, as a teenager, I was always kind of embarrassed of my parents. Oftentimes teenagers are. You don't want your parents around because you're ashamed of them. You're embarrassed of them, right? And then since I've become a child or a parent, now I'm ashamed of my kids being around, right? What are you guys doing? Here's the deal. Most of my job, it seems like, in some way, shape, or form, is to get Christians. As Joel and Sarah come on up, we're almost done. Is to get Christians to not be ashamed of God, to not be ashamed of the gospel. Jesus even said, if you deny me before men, I will deny you. And so it seems like most of my job is to say, to be bold in your faith, to trust him. Don't be ashamed of that, but be bold in your faith towards God. But in reality, this verse kind of should shift my focus. I shouldn't be worried as much about making sure that you're not ashamed of him. I should be making sure that he's not ashamed of us. But here's the wonderful truth is that those that are in faith, he's not ashamed of us. He's not saying like, well, I like half of them, but that one guy, we can't keep it. He's not like that. The same God of Jacob and Isaac and Abraham and all of them is the same God of Joel Hastings. And that doesn't make sense to me, but yet he's not ashamed of me whenever I have that faith to trust in him and I have that faith to long for him no matter what's in my path, because It was never about my past. It's always been about what he could do. So we need to learn to follow him. So band comes on up. I want to finish off with this story. You may have heard it before. But what does this look like? What does this look like? Back in the 1800s, I believe it was the Welsh Revival was a major revival in Wales that actually sparked revival all across the world, because one of the fruits of that revival is they had missionaries that went out throughout the entire world. Literally hundreds or thousands of missionaries left Wales and started to preach the gospel in all these foreign lands, and it started churches all over the world. Some of those missionaries actually went over to India, where there was hardly any gospel presence at all. And they started to go from village to village to village, which is all India was back in that time period. And they would go from village to village to village, and they would preach the gospel, and they preach the gospel, and they preach the gospel. And not very many people would convert, because that's just a completely different worldview than anything that they've ever heard. But they spent a little time in this village, and after preaching the gospel to nearly everybody, finally one man responded. One man responded to the gospel and believed. And then a short time later, his wife and his children also believed in the gospel. So now there's this small little village in India. They finally got their first convert. So the missionaries then said, all right, well, now it's your turn. Just keep preaching the gospel to these people. And they left, and they went on to the next village. And after the missionaries had left there, this man kept trying to preach the gospel, kept trying to witness to all the people around him in that village. But this obviously was going to make the tribal leadership very angry. Very upset, because now here's this Westerner in their mind coming in here preaching some sort of gospel that they didn't understand, that they didn't like here. It was a completely different way of life than what they have been taught, completely different religion here. And so they wanted to say, this cannot happen here. And so the chief actually called a meeting for the whole tribe, and he called them out, and then he called that family out in front of everybody with the whole tribe surrounding them. And he said, I'm going to make an example of this man. He looked at him and said, listen, you must recant of this Jesus. If you don't, I will kill you and your family. Recant now in front of everyone. And that brand new believer, with the whole village surrounding him, looked at that man, looked at the chief, and says, I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. You've no doubt heard this story, this song before. You might not have realized it was actually the words of a martyr. But in that moment, after he said, I've decided to follow Jesus, the chief was so angry, so upset there, that he was so embarrassed that somebody defied his leadership. He looked at the soldiers right beside him. He said, kill his children. And they came with spears, and they put spears straight to his children's stomachs. As they lay bleeding out, he said, look what you've done. Look what Jesus has done for you. Will you not recant? If you do not recant, then I will also kill your wife. Will you not recant? And whenever the man heard that, he looked straight at the chief one more time. He says, though none go with me, still I will follow. The chief was so angry and so upset at that moment that he turned to the soldier again and said, kill his wife. And the soldier came and he stabbed the wife straight through the heart. And she now lays dying on the ground beside her children. And he's standing there now all alone with the crowd all around him. And the chief at this point instead is begging him, will you please just not give it up? Will you please recant? Don't go on any further here. And in that moment he says, the world is behind me and the cross is before me. There is no turning back. Go behind me, the cross before me, the world behind. The soldiers knew what to do. They came and they killed that man by putting a spear straight through him. Now all four of that family is dead. The only Christians in the village. And I'm so thankful, though, that the story is never done for Christians, right? We've been singing his words, whether you realize that we've been singing the words of martyr for 100-some years now. But the story wasn't done even in that village. Because as a village, they have heard the gospel. Every single one of them heard the gospel being preached by the missionaries and being preached by this man. And now him and his family is dead. And they're all surrounding, and they don't know what to do, with tears filling their eyes. It said, finally, one person yelled out, saying, I belong to Jesus too. And everybody looked around. Who could be such a bold fool in this moment? Surely they know that they would die. And they looked around, and the man that yelled it out was none other than the chief himself. That he saw the sacrifice of this family, and he said, I see the sacrifice. I don't know who this Jesus is, but I want to know him. And he believed in mass revival broke out because one man said, I have decided to follow Jesus, even though it cost him everything. That is what we're called to do. This is the mission that we get to live for, because this is how great our Father is towards us. There is no turning back. Sing with us.